It was just another sunny afternoon at the park, birds chirping, kids laughing, and the faint hum of life buzzing in the background. But in a matter of seconds, everything changed. What started as a simple misunderstanding spiraled into a moment that would leave everyone speechless. A white woman, clutching her phone tightly, dialed 911, her voice trembling with urgency. "There's a black girl here," she said, her tone sharp and accusatory, "and I think she's up to something." The girl, no older than 14, stood, frozen, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her eyes wide with confusion. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was just waiting for her mom. But the woman wasn't having it. She was convinced the girl didn't belong there, and she wasn't going to let it slide. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the air grew thicker. The girl, whose name was Amara, tried to explain herself, but the woman wasn't listening. Instead, she stood there, arms crossed, her gaze locked on Amara as if she were a criminal. Passers-by began to notice, their whispers adding to the unease. Some shook their heads, others pulled out their phones to record. It was a scene that's become all too familiar in today's world, a moment where assumptions and prejudice take center stage. But what no one knew, not even the woman who called the cops, was that this story was about to take a turn no one could have predicted. When the police arrived, the woman pointed at Amara, her voice rising as she demanded they do something. The officers trained to handle these situations approached Amara cautiously, but before they could even ask her a single question, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. The doors swung open, and out stepped a woman who commanded attention. Without saying a word, she was tall, her posture straight, and her eyes sharp. She wore a blazer that screamed authority, and as she walked toward the scene, the crowd instinctively parted. This was Amara's mom, but she wasn't just any mom. She was Special Agent in Charge Elena Carter, one of the highest-ranking officials in the FBI. The woman who had called the cops froze, her face paling as realization dawned. The officers straightened up, their demeanor shifting instantly. Elena didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her presence alone was enough to silence everyone. She looked at her daughter, then at the woman, and finally at the officers. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. No one knew what to say. The woman who had been so confident moments ago was now stumbling over her words, trying to explain herself. But Elena wasn't interested in excuses. She turned to the officers and said, "I think we need to have a conversation about how this situation was handled." The crowd watched in stunned silence as Elena took control of the scene. But just as things seemed to be settling, a new wave of tension swept through the park. A man in a hoodie, who had been lingering at the edge of the crowd, suddenly turned and bolted. Elena's eyes snapped toward him, and without hesitation, she barked an order to the officers. "Don't let him get away!" she shouted. The officers sprang into action, chasing after the man as the crowd erupted into chaos. Who was he? What did he have to do with this, and why was Elena so determined to catch him? The answers to those questions would change everything, but for now, all anyone could do was watch and wait as the story unfolded, leaving everyone on edge and desperate to know what would happen next. As the officers sprinted after the hooded man, Elena Carter remained calm, her years of training kicking in. She turned to Amara, her daughter, and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice softening for the first time since she arrived. Amara nodded, though her eyes still held a mix of fear and confusion. "I didn't do anything wrong, Mom," she said quietly. "I was just waiting for you." Elena's jaw tightened, but she gave her daughter a small, reassuring smile. "I know, sweetheart. This isn't your fault." Her gaze then shifted to the woman who had called the cops, who was now visibly shaken, her earlier confidence completely shattered. Elena didn't say a word to her, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Meanwhile, the officers chasing the hooded man were struggling to keep up. He was fast, weaving through the park with the agility of someone who knew the area well. But why was he running? Was he connected to the woman who had called the cops? Or was this something entirely different? The officers radioed for backup, their voices crackling with urgency. Elena, still standing with Amara, pulled out her phone and made a quick call. "I need eyes on the park," she said to whoever was on the other end. "We've got a runner and I want to know who he is and why he's here." She paused, listening for a moment, then added, "And pull up everything you can on the woman. Who called this in? I want to know who she is, too." As the chaos unfolded, the crowd began to disperse, some out of fear, others out of curiosity. But a few stayed, their phones still recording, eager to capture whatever happened next. Among them was a young man named Marcus, a local journalist who had been in the park working on a story about community tensions. He had seen everything: the confrontation, the arrival of Elena, the chase, and he knew this was bigger than just a misunderstanding. This was a story that could spark a national conversation. He quickly began typing notes into his phone, his mind racing with questions. Who was the hooded man? Why had Elena reacted so strongly to his presence? And what did this all mean for the woman who had called the cops? Back at the scene, Elena was now speaking with the officers who had stayed behind. "I want a full report on this incident," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "And I want to know why my daughter was treated like a suspect, when she was clearly just waiting for me." The officers nodded, their expressions serious. They knew better than to question Elena Carter. She wasn't just a mother. She was a force to be reckoned with, someone who had spent her career taking down some of the most dangerous criminals in the country. But even she couldn't have predicted how this day would unfold. As the minutes passed, the tension in the air grew thicker. The woman who had called the cops was now sitting on a bench, her head in her hands. She looked defeated, but there was also a flicker of fear in her eyes. What was she so afraid of? Was it Elena's presence, or was it something deeper? Marcus, the journalist, approached her cautiously, his phone still recording. "Ma'am," he said gently, "can you tell me what happened here? Why did you call the police on that girl?" The woman looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt and desperation. I thought she was stealing," she stammered. "I saw her near my bag and I thought—" Her voice trailed off and she looked away, unable to meet Marcus's gaze, but Marcus wasn't convinced. Something about her story didn't add up. Why had she been so quick to assume the worst? And why had she been so adamant about calling the cops? He made a mental note to dig deeper into her background, to see if there was more to her than met the eye. Meanwhile, Elena was still on the phone, her voice low but intense. "I don't care how you do it," she said. "I want that man found, and I want to know what he was doing here." She paused, listening, then nodded. "Good. Keep me updated." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, the sense of unease only grew. The hooded man was still out there, and no one knew what he was capable of. The woman who had called the cops was now being questioned by the officers, her story unraveling with every word she spoke. And Elena, standing tall and resolute, was determined to get to the bottom of it all. But as the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding in the park. This was about something much bigger, something that could change everything. And then, just as the tension seemed to reach its peak, Elena's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her expression hardening as she read the message. "We've got him," it said. "But you're not going to believe what we found." Elena's heart raced as she quickly typed a reply. "On my way." She turned to Amara, who was still standing by her side, and gave her a quick hug. "Stay here with the officers," she said. "I'll be back soon." And with that, she was gone, striding toward her SUV with a sense of purpose that left no doubt. Whatever was happening, it was far from over. As the SUV pulled away, Marcus watched from a distance, his mind racing with possibilities. He knew he had to follow this story, no matter where it led. But as he turned back to the park, he couldn't shake the feeling that something much darker was at play. The hooded man, the woman who had called the cops, Elena's sudden urgency. It all pointed to something bigger, something more dangerous than anyone realized. And as the first stars began to appear in the night sky, one thing was certain. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. But at what cost? As Elena's SUV sped through the city streets, her mind raced with possibilities. The message on her phone had been cryptic, but the urgency in it was unmistakable. They had found the hooded man. But what had they discovered? She tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her thoughts briefly flickering back to Amara. She hated leaving her daughter behind, especially after what had just happened. But this was bigger than just one incident. This was about uncovering the truth, no matter how ugly it might be. When Elena arrived at the location, a dimly lit warehouse on the outskirts of town, she was met by a team of agents, their faces grim. "He's inside," one of them said, nodding toward the building. "But you need to see this for yourself." Elena nodded, her expression unreadable as she followed them inside. The warehouse was cluttered with boxes and machinery, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of oil. And there, in the center of the room, was the hooded man, now handcuffed and surrounded by agents. His hood had been pulled back, revealing a face that was both familiar and unsettling. Elena's eyes narrowed as she stepped closer. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. The man didn't answer at first, his gaze darting around the room, as if searching for an escape. But when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost eerily so. "You don't know me," he said, "but you will soon." Elena's jaw tightened. She didn't have time for games. "What were you doing at the park?" she asked, her tone sharp. "And what do you have to do with the woman who called the cops on my daughter?" The man smirked, a faint glint of amusement in his eyes. "Let's just say I was in the right place at the right time," he said cryptically. "But if you want answers, you're going to have to dig deeper." Elena's patience was wearing thin, but she knew better than to let her emotions get the best of her. She turned to one of the agents. "Search him," she ordered. "I want to know everything about him, his name, his background, his connections, and I want it now." The agent nodded and began rifling through the man's pockets, pulling out a wallet, a phone, and a small folded piece of paper. Elena's eyes locked onto the paper as the agent handed it to her. She unfolded it carefully, her heart pounding as she read the words scrawled across it. "You're closer than you think." Meanwhile, back at the park, Amara was sitting in the back of a police car, wrapped in a blanket one of the officers had given her. She was still shaken, her mind replaying the events of the day over and over. Why had that woman accused her? And why had her mom reacted so strongly to the hooded man? She glanced at the officers standing nearby, their faces tense as they spoke in hushed tones. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could tell it wasn't good. Something was happening, something big, and she had a sinking feeling that her mom was right in the middle of it. Marcus, the journalist, was still at the park too, his phone buzzing with notifications as he tried to piece together the story. He had already uploaded a short clip of the confrontation to social media, and it was spreading like wildfire. The comments were pouring in, some outraged, others defensive, but all of them demanding answers. Marcus knew he had to stay on top of this to follow every lead and uncover the truth. But as he scrolled through the messages on his phone, one in particular caught his eye. It was from an anonymous account, just a single sentence. "You're asking the wrong questions. Backy." At the warehouse, Elena was still staring at the note in her hands, her mind racing. "You're closer than you think." What did it mean? Was it a threat, a warning, or something else entirely? She turned back to the hooded man, her eyes blazing with determination. "Who gave you this?" she demanded, holding up the note. The man just smiled, his expression infuriatingly calm. "You'll find out soon enough," he said. "But I wouldn't waste time here if I were you. You might want to check on your daughter." Elena's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. But the man didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening. "Tick-tock, Agent Carter," he said. "Time's running out." Without another word, Elena turned and stormed out of the warehouse, her phone already in her hand as she dialed the officers at the park. "Is Amara safe?" she asked as soon as someone picked up. There was a pause on the other end, and then a voice said, "We're keeping an eye on her, but something's happening here. You need to come back." Elena's heart sank as she ended the call and jumped back into her SUV. Whatever was going on, it was far from over. And as she sped back toward the park, one thought kept echoing in her mind. Who was behind all of this, and what did they want? As the night deepened, the tension only grew. The hooded man's cryptic words, the anonymous message to Marcus, the unease at the park, it was all connected. But how? And what did it have to do with Amara? The answers were out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. But as the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, one thing was clear. This was just the beginning. The real story was only just starting to unfold, and no one was ready for what was coming next. Elena's SUV screeched to a halt near the park, the tires kicking up gravel as she jumped out and sprinted toward the police cars. Her heart was pounding, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. The officers had said something was happening, but what? Was Amara safe? As she approached, she saw a small crowd gathered near the edge of the park, their faces tense and their voices hushed. The officers were trying to keep order, but it was clear that something had shifted, something big. Amara was still sitting in the back of the police car, her face pale, but her eyes alert. When she saw her mom, she immediately sat up straighter, relief flooding her features. "Mom," she called out, her voice trembling. Elena rushed to her side, pulling open the door and wrapping her in a tight hug. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Amara nodded, but her eyes were wide with fear. "I'm fine, but something's going on. The officers got a call, and now they're all acting weird." Elena's stomach churned. She didn't like the sound of that. Before she could ask more questions, one of the officers approached, his face grim. "Agent Carter," he said, his voice low. "We just got word from dispatch. There's been a development." Elena's eyes narrowed. What kind of development? The officer hesitated, glancing at Amara before speaking. "We've identified the woman who called the cops on your daughter. Her name is Linda Harper, and she's not who she says she is." Elena's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice sharp. The officer took a deep breath. "She's got a record, fraud, identity theft, even ties to a known criminal organization. We think she might have been trying to distract us while something bigger was going down." Elena's mind raced. If Linda Harper was connected to a criminal organization, then this wasn't just about Amara. This was about something much larger, something that had been in motion long before today. She turned to Amara, her expression softening. "Stay here with the officers," she said firmly. "I need to figure out what's going on." Amara nodded, though her eyes were filled with worry. "Be careful, Mom," she whispered. Elena gave her a quick kiss on the forehead before turning back to the officer. "Where's Linda now?" she asked. The officer gestured toward a nearby patrol car. "We've got her in custody, but she's not talking. She just keeps saying she wants a lawyer." Elena's jaw tightened. She didn't have time for this. "Let me talk to her," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. The officer nodded and led her to the car, where Linda was sitting in the back seat, her arms crossed and her face defiant. When she saw Elena, her expression faltered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered, her mask of indifference slipping back into. Elena leaned down, her eyes locking onto Linda's. "Who are you working for?" she demanded, her voice low and dangerous. Linda smirked, though there was a flicker of fear in her eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her tone dripping with false innocence. Elena wasn't buying it. "Cut the act," she snapped. "We know about your record, we know you're connected, and we know this wasn't just about my daughter. So tell me, what's really going on?" Linda's smirk faded, replaced by a look of cold calculation. "You're in over your head, Agent Carter," she said quietly. "You think you're chasing shadows, but the truth is you're the one being hunted." Elena's blood ran cold, but she didn't let it show. "Is that a threat?" she asked, her voice steady. Linda leaned back in her seat, her expression unreadable. "It's a warning," she said. "You're playing a dangerous game, and if you're not careful, you're going to lose." Before Elena could respond, her phone buzzed. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen, her heart sinking as she read the message. "We've got a problem. The hooded man escaped." Elena's mind raced. How? He had been surrounded by agents, handcuffed and under constant surveillance. This wasn't just a coincidence, it was a well-orchestrated plan. And if the hooded man was free, then whatever was happening was far from over. She turned back to Linda, her eyes blazing with determination. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low and fierce. "I'm going to find out who's behind this, and when I do, you're going to wish you'd talked." Linda didn't respond, but the faintest hint of a smile played on her lips, sending a chill down Elena's spine. As Elena walked away, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a video message from an unknown number. She opened it, her heart pounding as she saw the hooded man's face fill the screen. "You're running out of time, Agent Carter," he said, his voice cold and mocking. "If you want to save your daughter, you'll stop asking questions and start listening. The clock is ticking." The screen went dark, leaving Elena standing there, her mind racing. What did he mean? What were they planning, and how was Amara involved? She glanced back at her daughter, who was still sitting in the police car, her face pale but determined. Elena knew she had to act fast. Whatever was coming, it was bigger than she had imagined, and the stakes were higher than ever. As the night deepened, the tension in the air grew almost unbearable. The park, once a place of laughter and joy, now felt like a battlefield, with shadows lurking around every corner and danger closing in from all sides. Elena knew she was running out of time, but she also knew one thing for certain. She would do whatever it took to protect her daughter and uncover the truth, no matter the cost. But as she stood there, her phone buzzing with yet another message, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and when they did, nothing would ever be the same. The clock was ticking and the countdown to the climax had begun.